Before we get started with today's episode, I want to take a minute to tell you about a free workshop for dance teachers that's coming up Sunday, August 9th at 9 a.m. Pacific or 12 p.m. Eastern. It's no secret that the demands for flexibility have increased in the dance world in recent years. But what about those students who seem to hit a flexibility plateau? You know the ones. They work hard, stretch constantly, follow all of your advice, and still don't seem to make the progress their peers do. Flexibility Fix is a free workshop designed to help teachers identify and understand what is limiting their dancers' flexibility to help them push past their plateau safely and effectively. I would love to have you join me on Sunday, August 9th. For more information and to save your free spot in the workshop, go to www.allegroperformance.com/flexibility-fix. And now, here's today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive in, I just want to say a big thank you to those of you in the community who have supported the show through the support link in the show notes of the episodes. To be perfectly honest with you, I completely forgot that there was even a link there, but recently, I've had a couple of donations come through, and I really, truly appreciate it. There is obviously no obligation to donate or support the show in that way. And in fact, listening to episodes, downloading them, liking them, sharing them, subscribing to the podcast, all of that stuff is so impactful as well. But I do truly appreciate those people who sent a little monetary donation as well. There will never be content on this podcast that is put behind a paywall, so it is absolutely no obligation to donate. But I just wanted to shout out because, like I said, I kind of forgot it was there, and then recently there's been a couple of donations that have come in. So thank you to those of you who have donated. I really appreciate it. All right. Today, we are going to be talking about balance and training balance and improving balance in dancers. And this is a topic that came up because I've had a couple of dancers this summer who I've been working with where this has been one of their primary goals, where they want to improve their specifically single leg balance for things like turns and things like that. But we're just going to talk about balance a little bit more generally today because I realized I've actually not done a podcast episode on this topic at all. So in the future, I may dive into more specific balance demands for certain tasks like, say, turning. But today we're just going to talk about balance more broadly because it is actually quite a complex thing to train. And I think a lot of dancers who want to improve their balance, they often will kind of go on the internet and look for exercises, and whether that's on social media or whether that's Googling things, finding things on YouTube, whatever it is, and they'll see all of these like kind of crazy, wild things that are being done sometimes where people are, balancing on their block of their point shoe on a Bosu ball while balancing a barbell on their head, or like just all of this crazy, wild stuff. And at the end of the day, that may not be the most effective way for dancers to train their balance. So in order to figure out what the most effective way is, we need to understand balance systems and what controls balance and where we might need to work to improve our balance if that is a goal that a dancer has. So what is balance? Balance is essentially the ability to control the body's center of mass over its base of support. So that's kind of like the official definition. That's what I learned probably in school, probably back when I was doing my kinesiology degree. But like, what does that actually mean? What is our center of mass? Our center of mass is the area of our body or the area in our body where our mass or our weight is concentrated the most. And so our center of mass is going to change depending on what shape or position our body is in. And so it's not static in nature necessarily. If I move my arm out to the side, where my center of mass is concentrated is going to change. So I have to be able to react to that. And our center of mass is going to change as we grow and as bodies change shapes and sizes and things like that as well. So it is our ability to control our center of mass over our base of support. What is our base of support? Our base of support is the area underneath the body, or like the area underneath you that you're being supported by. So most often we're going to think of our base of support as our feet, but depending on the genre or style of dance that we're doing, if we're on the floor, our base of support might be our butt, it might be our back. If we're lying down, it might be our hands, it might be our head, it might be our shoulder, it could be anything. You get the idea. But for simplicity, for talking about balance for today, we're going to assume we're in an upright posture and we're thinking about our base of support being our feet. And so we need to be able to control that center of mass over our base of support. And if our base of support is bigger, so that could be because we have bigger feet, but it can also just be if our feet are more stable on the ground. So if we have 2 feet on the ground and our feet are wider apart from each other, that is going to increase the area of our base of support. It's going to be easier to control our center of mass over that. If we narrow that base, so maybe we still have 2 feet on the ground, but we're standing in tandem, so one foot's directly in front of the other, that is a much more narrow base. It's going to be a little bit harder to control our center of mass. If we take 1 foot away, so now we're balancing on a single leg, and this is often the type of balance dancers talk about wanting to improve or work on is single leg balance. The reason why it is more challenging is we've taken 1 foot away, our base of support is smaller. And so now we have to be able to shift or react our center of mass over a much smaller base of support. If we go up onto, say, demi-point or even point, like onto our box on a point shoe, again, that base of support gets smaller still. So you can see how these positions that you instinctively know it is harder to balance on a rise or on demi-point than it is standing with both your feet on the ground. Now you understand a little bit about why that is going to be more challenging, because our center of mass is changing a little bit with those changes in position, but the thing that's changing the most is that base of support. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The other thing that we need to understand about balance in dance, and maybe this is one of the things that dancers sometimes miss the mark on when they're working on balance training, is that dance requires very large amounts of dynamic balance. And often when we look at what dancers are doing to, quote unquote, train their balance or to practice balancing or improving balance, they're often working on very static exercises or in very static positions. So you'll see dancers stand on 1 foot, maybe try and rise onto like a demi-point and hold that position. Or maybe they're in passé and they're trying to hold a passé position. That is a very static type of balance. And there can be utility in training that type of balance. But if you actually think about dance and what makes dance unique and what makes dance challenging is that we are constantly moving. Our base of support is constantly changing and constantly in motion. And our center of mass has to be able to react to that and to be able to control itself over a base of support that is in motion. So that's just a little bit about why balance can be tricky or challenging in dancers, and why perhaps if you have been working on your balance, but you're not seeing it translate through to improved balance or more stability in your dancing, that could potentially be why. All right, there are 3 main systems that contribute to our balance, and these are sensory systems. So balance is essentially like a feedback loop. So we get information from these sensory systems and it feeds that information into our nervous system, into our brain is the easiest way of thinking about that. And that is what is going to allow us to control those movements over that base of support. So we have those 3 main systems. And if any one of those 3 systems is not working optimally, or if those 3 systems aren't working well together, we can struggle or have challenges with balance. So the first of those systems, and these are in no particular order, but the first of these systems is our vision. So we use our eyes and use our our vision a lot to help with our balance. And so our vision tells our brain where you are, what direction you're moving in. It tells you information about your environment and your surroundings. We can use our vision to tell us if there's, a bump in the road or a step we have to go up, a curb, things like that. And so we can then react to those changes that are going to be happening. Dancers very, very often rely really heavily on their vision, part of their balance. And I'm sure all of you have been in a situation where you've been trying to balance, let's use passé as an example again. So in that passé position, you're trying to balance and you have a teacher who will instruct you, or maybe you instinctively yourself try and find a spot on the wall, preferably something that's not moving, but something that you can lock in your gaze or lock in your focus, your vision, to stare at that spot to help you balance. That is something that every dancer at some point has been taught to do. And there's nothing wrong with this per se, but if we're thinking about how do we improve our balance, how do we practice our balance, we want to try and think about the environments that we're going to be in where balance is going to be demanded of us. And more often than not, we will get ourselves into situations where we actually can't use our vision in the same way. So if when we're practicing balance, we're relying really, really heavily on our vision, and like I said, a lot of dancers do this. A lot of dancers do this as well because we often train in front of mirrors. This is a little bit different because it's more complex because there's motor learning stuff that gets involved more looking at mirrors as well. But similar idea, if you're relying heavily on mirrors to know where you are in your environment, where your body is in space and things like that, then we may run into issues if you are then in a situation where you cannot rely as heavily on your vision. So if we think about going from a studio into a stage environment, there's no mirrors, so we can't use those. But even if you often use the strategy in the studio of finding a spot to look at, and then you're on a stage and there's bright stage lights and it's essentially black in front of you. Anyone who's been on the stage with stage lights knows that you can't really see the audience and everything kind of just appears black in front of you. It can become very, very disorienting and our balance will really suffer. And I hear this a lot from dancers who they don't know the reason, but they will say things like, I can always nail my triple turn in the studio in rehearsal. And when I go and perform on stage, I'm super wobbly and I always fall out of it. Things like that. Or I have to do this penché where I'm balancing on one leg or whatever it is. And they, have practiced it over and over and over and over again and started to get very good at it in the studio. And then they go on stage and they kind of lose the skill a little bit. And it may be because they're relying really heavily on vision. And when you're on stage, it is very, very hard to rely on vision. Everything becomes just kind of a little bit of a black void. The same, we use vision really heavily for spotting with turns in dance. And that's actually, spotting's a really interesting concept, and I may actually do a whole podcast episode on it. So I'm not going to get into it too much today because not every sport spots. So other sports that spin the same way we do, but in dance we are taught to spot our head in turning, and part of that is using that visual input as a way of controlling the movement or controlling our balance when we are turning. So that was a very long-winded way of saying that vision is one of the systems that helps contribute to our balance, and one that I see dancers often rely really heavily on, but one that can be problematic if it is the strategy that they've used the most in terms of practicing their balance, if that strategy then gets taken away in performance type settings. Also, if we have dancers who have visual impairments of some sort. So whether I've had a dancer in the past who had issues with depth perception because they're actually blind in one eye. And so it can really affect their balance if, again, they're relying really heavily on their balance relying really heavily on their vision for their balance system if there's any sort of visual impairments going on. So just something else to consider as well. System number 2 that is involved in balance is what is called our vestibular system. And this is essentially the sensory system within our inner ear, and it manages our balance, our posture, and our spatial orientation. And it does this by detecting mostly where the position of our head is in space, but it can also detect rotational movements and acceleration and deceleration. So it kind of lets us know if we're in movement or not in movement. It is the system that is often very involved when people deal with things like dizziness or motion sickness and things like that, if they're having issues with their vestibular system. So our vestibular system is super important for our body knowing its orientation within space and whether we're in motion or at rest. Again, the vestibular system is incredibly complex, and there's a whole area of physiotherapy that is specialized in what we call vestibular rehab for people who have issues within this system. So I'm not going to get into it in too much depth today, but just to say that it is one of the systems that helps contribute to our balance and to our kind of spatial awareness in our environments. It can be affected, like I said, if people have vestibular issues. So this can be from injuries, it can be from illnesses, but it can also be affected if people have just had temporary illnesses, like an ear infection can actually really impact people's vestibular system, or if they have fluid in their ears or things like that. And so temporarily we may have dancers who feel very off balance if they've had a head cold or something like that, and maybe they're congested and there's still some fluid in that area. And all of a sudden a dancer's I can't even stand on one leg, or I can't turn, I can't spot, whatever it is that they're reporting. Could be because the vestibular system can be affected in instances of things like illness. The really cool thing about the vestibular system is that we can train the system through controlled exposure to different movements and different stimulus, and we will then get adaptations to that system. And so if we have somebody who is struggling with vestibular symptoms, so this is a little bit different than balance, but balance could be one of those symptoms, but a lot of times people will get nausea and dizziness and things like that. We can improve those symptoms through controlled exposure to some of those movements that may be provoking. So oftentimes it's rotational movements, but again, it could be acceleration, deceleration. It can have to do with the vestibular system. There's actually a very, very, very close tie-in of the vestibular and visual system. And again, I don't want to get too bogged down by details today, but it is a very cool system in the sense that the way that we can train it is through these controlled exposures to the system, and it adapts very, very well to then change that sensory information and kind of teach our brain how to understand and interpret that information. So first system vision, second system vestibular, and then our third system is what we call our proprioceptive system, or a proprioception. And this is sensory information that comes from our muscles and our tendons and our joints. There's little receptors in those areas that send the sensory information back to your brain and essentially tells your body, or tells your brain, where your body is in space. So this is our ability to know where our joints are, how our body is moving and functioning without us actually visually being able to see it. So if you close your eyes and you then move a part of your body, say you bend your arm, you'll know that your arm is bent, and you'll even know how bent it is. So you can tell the difference between bending, say, your elbow to 90 degrees versus bending your elbow just 10 degrees without visually being able to see it, because of these receptors that we have within our muscles and joints and tendons and all of those types of things. It not only tells us where our joints are positioned, or where our body is in space, but it also tells us how much force we might be producing. So if we think about, I don't know if you've ever gone to lift up something and you think it's going to be really heavy. And so you get prepared to exert more force, or your muscles get prepared to resist against a higher amount of force. And I don't know, let's say it's a milk jug or whatever, and it ends up being empty. And so it kind of almost goes flying because you go to lift it up and you're totally not expecting it to have been as light as it was. This is a little bit due to that proprioceptive system, because it has the ability to to detect how much force it is that we are producing or using. The proprioceptive system is the system that is most often impaired if we are dealing with injury. So any dancer who is rehabilitating from an injury, proprioceptive training is almost always going to be part of that rehabilitation. And especially when we think about like lower extremity rehab, so if it's like a knee injury or an ankle sprain or something like that, proprioception often becomes like a very big part of that rehab because those sensory messages get interrupted when we have injuries to whether it's a ligament or a muscle or tendon or whatever the injured structure is. And so proprioception is an area we focus on quite a lot in rehab. But again, it plays a big part in just general balance training. So even if you haven't had an injury, but you're looking to improve your balance, proprioception is probably an area that we're going to spend lots of time on. And proprioception can also be impacted or affected in people who are more hypermobile. If we're more hypermobile, we often don't get the same amount of proprioceptive input from similar stimulus. And so people often are less aware of where their body might be in space. So you'll often hear hypermobile people kind of report being really, really clumsy. Like, oh, I always walk into like doorways, I knock things over, I stub my toe all the time. And a lot of dancers joke about this because they're like, I can do really hard, complex things in dance and I can't like walk down the hallway without tripping or things like that. But it often has to do with their proprioceptive system being a little bit impaired from their hypermobility. They require larger amounts of input to get the same type of sensory information. So that is one of the reasons why they can often do really hard, complex things because it requires more input. But oftentimes people, if they're a bit impaired in their proprioceptive system, they actually do better with more resistance, whether that's like resistance bands or loading them with weight or things like that, because it gives them more feedback of where their body is in space. So that's just a very quick Coles Notes version of the proprioceptive system. So those three systems all work together to help control balance in our body and help us to coordinate our balance responses. So that response to our center of mass changing over our base of support. If we want to think about improving our balance, it is then really important to know which of these three systems is, I don't want to say the most impaired, because in some cases it may not be that one is impaired. It may just be that we want to optimize one of these three systems in order to get the most bang for our buck with our balance training. So if you are a dancer who already relies really heavily on your vision to balance, so that's those, people who might pick a spot on the wall, focus really heavily on it, and you're like, okay, as long as I'm like really focused on that one spot, I can like balance on one leg or whatever it is. Practicing balance tasks or trying to train balance in a way that really involves your vision may not be the best bang for your buck. We may actually want to remove your visual system to force you or to encourage you to rely more heavily on the other two systems, so proprioception and vestibular system, in order to see improvements in your balance. So maybe we make you close your eyes while you're balancing, or maybe that's probably the easiest example of removing that visual stimulus. I was going to say sometimes we'll just like ask people to not focus on one specific thing, but closing eyes is probably the better example. So, like I said, it's important to know which system we're going after in order to maximize our outputs from balance training. If I have a dancer who's really hypermobile and I know they really struggle with proprioception, that is probably the system I'm going to try and challenge the most rather than challenging their visual system. So I may not be doing eyes closed balancing with a dancer who struggles with proprioception. We may be doing more proprioceptive balance tasks. So hopefully that makes sense. But like I said, it's important to understand that there's three systems that affect balance, and that if we want to optimize balance training, we want to, be working with all three systems, but in a lot of cases, we may want to actually be prioritizing one system over another if there is a system that is a bit weaker or maybe struggles more with those balance tasks. There are a couple of other things that can affect balance that have less to do with these three systems, and I just want to mention them because these often come up in conversations when we're talking about balance training in dancers, but strength plays a big role in balance as well. And so I will have dancers who sort of report that they really struggle with balance in certain positions or with certain tasks, but when we actually look at it, it's probably more of a strength issue than a balance issue. If you don't have the strength to be able to control your body in a certain position, so again, remember balance is controlling our center of mass over our base of support. If we do not have the strength to control that center of mass over that base of support, we are going to struggle with balance. But doing a lot of balance training when strength is maybe the underlying issue is not going to be the most effective strategy. So we definitely need to consider strength when we are looking at balance as well. And a really good example of this is if somebody's rehabbing from an ankle sprain. Oftentimes people will be like, oh yeah, like things are good. It feels really good, but my balance still isn't 100%. And when we look at it, maybe their proprioception is not 100%. Like maybe it is truly a balance issue, but oftentimes it is a bit of a strength issue. So maybe their strength is not yet back to 100%. So maybe their strength is at about 80%. So again, the exercises that we're going to give them and the program that they're going to work on needs to be focused on that strength in order to get that balance back as well. If we only did balance exercises and proprioceptive exercises and they're missing that 20% of strength from that ankle sprain, they're not going to see the improvements they want to see in their balance. So we need to consider strength in addition to our balance systems. We need to consider fatigue. So when we're fatigued, our balance is going to decrease. And this is for a variety of reasons, but when we are fatigued, we see decreased reaction times, we see decreased motor control, and we see a decrease in proprioception. So there are lots of things that happen when our body gets fatigued that will often present as decreased balance. And again, working on balance exercises may not be helpful if the body is already in a fatigued state and is already struggling to recover or to be able to perform. So we need to look at that or to consider that. So if you're a dancer where you're like, oh, at the beginning of class, I can balance super well and I can do, quadruple turns or whatever it is. But by the end of class, I'm like falling apart and I'm wobbly and shaky and I feel like I can't balance on my leg. It's probably a sign of fatigue. It's probably not a sign that you need to work more on your balance training. It's probably a sign that maybe we need to work more on endurance and fatigue or rest and recovery or wherever that fatigue is coming from. So fatigue can affect balance, strength can affect balance. And then one of the other things I see commonly, and this isn't necessarily a separate thing, we've kind of been talking about it all along, but I get dancers who come in who are like, I've been practicing my balance, I've like really, really been working on it, but it's just not improving. And when we look at what they've actually been doing, they've only been practicing static balance. So, say standing on one leg and trying to hold that position or trying to, stand in passé and then close their eyes or whatever it is. But they're static positions that they have been practicing. And although static positions can be really useful and can be a good place to start, they are often not enough when we are thinking about balance training, specifically for dancers. Because again, when we think about dance, it's all of these transitions to and from positions. It is transitions of our base of support moving on us. So our balance training should reflect that as well. It should look like transitions into and out of positions that we want to balance in. A lot of dancers, especially if we're thinking about balance when it comes to turns, they can statically hold a turn position, whatever position they're turning in. Let's just call it like parallel passé. they can statically hold that position. But as soon as we ask them to go from their preparation into that position, so that transition into that position, that's when they lose it. So if you can't do that effectively, then we're not going to be able to turn super effectively. So those transitions into and out of balance positions are super important so that it is a more dynamic sort of activity, I guess is the right word. And then also practicing maintaining our balance while other parts of our body are moving around us. And I don't often see enough of this when it comes to balance training. Again, like exercises, like if you just see the exercises that people are posting online and things like that, oftentimes, again, they're very static positions. And what we want in dance is that maybe we're standing on one leg and we want that leg to be super stable. That's our base of support. But our head is moving all sorts of different directions. And maybe our arms are doing one thing and our other leg is doing something else. Kind of the same as dance, sounding familiar. And we need to be able to balance while all of that is going on. And oftentimes our balance training, when we look at what we're actually doing exercise-wise, does not reflect that the same way. So we need to have this more dynamic element to it, where we're either transitioning in and out of positions, or we're holding a more static position, but there is movement of other body parts happening that our body needs to react to. So as our the leg you're not balancing on, or as your arms move, that's going to change where your center of mass is. And you have to be able to react to that to keep it balanced over that base of support. And that's often a piece that is missing in balance training programs. So I just wanted to mention those things because, like I said, although we want to focus on vision, vestibular, and proprioceptive systems, it is important to know that there's other things that feed into it and may be affecting balance as well. So key takeaways from today's episode: balance is not necessarily a talent or something that you just are born with or not born with. Sometimes I hear dancers say things like that where they're just like, oh, I'm just not good at balancing, or I'm not good at turn. You hear it a lot with regards to turns. I'm just not a turning person. Turning requires high levels of balance, but it is essentially a dynamic balance activity. And it is not necessarily something you're born with or not born with. It's not just a God-given talent. It is a skill, and it is a skill that you can train. And these systems are very adaptable if we expose them and train them. So that's one big takeaway. Another takeaway is that in order for a dancer to have really good balance, they need to have really good balance recovery. And again, it's just this idea that it needs to be dynamic in nature and not static in nature. So we'll see dancers, like I said, balancing in a point shoe on a Bosu ball with things balanced on top of their head and be able to hold that for like 2 minutes. And yes, that is impressive, but that doesn't tell me anything about their dynamic balance or their ability to demonstrate balance recovery. And that is a far more important skill for a dancer in terms of its application and functional carryover into dance activities. And then finally, and probably the most important, training balance involves integration of our strength system, our sensory systems, so those ones we just talked about, our vision, proprioception, and vestibular systems, and it involves practice. So again, these systems are adaptable. They do change and respond to training and to practice, but we need to actually put in the time and the effort to practice it. So it is one of those things that sometimes maybe gets put a bit on the back burner because it's not the flashiest of skills in terms of what dancers are working on. It's not, big, powerful, dynamic jumping skills, or it's not flexibility skills or things like that, but it is a really important skill to have. And the dancers who can make their movement look the most fluid on stage and have the ability to then be able to really focus on artistic expression are often the dancers who have incredible dynamic balance. So they're not wobbling in their transitions between steps. They're able to suspend and they're able to create those moments of magic or those moments of brilliance because they have good control of their dynamic balance systems. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap it up today. So I hope that it was helpful in terms of learning a little bit more about what balance is and what controls it and how we think about it in the body. I did not get too much into like specific balance drills and things like that. I always find that type of stuff hard to present in a podcast format. But if this is of interest to you and you want more examples of like specific balance drills that might focus more on like the proprioceptive system or more on the vestibular system and what have you, send me a message and I will look into doing some of that, maybe more on social media. I feel like it's a bit easier on Instagram in like video or reels format to be able to present some of that information. But let me know if that would be helpful or interesting to you, and I will look at doing that if there is interest. Hopefully that was helpful for you and gives you some ideas about ways to approach your balance and balance practice. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to send me a message, reach out. I am always happy to connect with all of you. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.